Throughout human history, revolutions have taken place that changed power, destroyed old systems, and created new states. They are written about in textbooks. Their names are remembered. But history is not made up of victories alone. Much more often, revolutions never happened. Thousands of people took to the streets, sometimes hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, and yet everything ended with nothing. The system survived, the names disappeared, the memory was erased. You are watching the Iceberg Project, and today we explore the iceberg of failed revolutions, from small conspiracies to movements involving entire societies. Level 1 of the iceberg, hundreds of participants. The first level of the iceberg is the Decembrist Revolt, an event that took place in December 1825 during a period of power transition in the Russian Empire. After the death of Emperor Alexander I, uncertainty emerged over the succession to the throne. During this period, a group of officers belonging to secret societies attempted a political uprising. Most participants were nobles and military officers with experience in the Napoleonic Wars and familiarity with European political models. The declared demands included the abolition of serfdom, the introduction of a constitution, and limitations on autocratic power. There was no unified vision of the future political system within the movement. Both a constitutional monarchy and a republic were considered. On December 14, 1825, approximately 3,000 soldiers were brought to Senate Square in St. Petersburg. The leadership of the uprising was decentralized, and there was no single operational plan. Attempts to persuade other military units to join the revolt were unsuccessful. Government forces retained control of the situation. After several hours of confrontation, the uprising was suppressed. Artillery units were used during the events. Following the investigation, 5 leaders of the movement were executed. The remaining participants were sentenced to forced labor and exile. The secret societies were dismantled. The Decembrist Revolt did not lead to changes in the state system and remained a localized episode in the political history of the early 19th century. The next event at this level is the Gunpowder Plot, which took place in England in 1605. At the beginning of the 17th century, religious tensions in the country remained high. After the Reformation, Catholics lived under legal restrictions, and the reign of King James I failed to meet the expectations of parts of the Catholic nobility who had hoped for a more tolerant policy. Against this background, a group of Catholic conspirators developed a plan to eliminate the king and the highest bodies of state power. The objective of the plot was the simultaneous destruction of the king, members of parliament, and leading nobles during the ceremonial opening of a parliamentary session. The plan involved detonating the House of Lords using gunpowder. 36 barrels of explosives were placed in the cellars beneath the Palace of Westminster. One of the conspirators was Guy Fawkes, who was tasked with igniting the charge. The conspiracy remained secret until an anonymous letter was received, warning one of the lords about the planned explosion. On the night of November 5, 1605, the parliamentary cellars were searched, and Guy Fawkes was arrested while guarding the gunpowder. Following the arrest, the plot was fully uncovered. The conspirators were detained, interrogated, and later executed. The explosion never occurred, and the attempt to violently change the political system was stopped before Parliament convened. The Gunpowder Plot did not result in changes to the system of governance. On the contrary, it became a justification for stricter anti-Catholic legislation and increased state control. In terms of scale, it was an attempted political coup limited to a narrow circle of individuals and lacking broad public support. The next event at this level is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which took place in the United States in 1859. In the second half of the 19th century, the issue of slavery remained one of the central political and social problems in the United States. The country was divided between the slaveholding southern states and the North, where the abolitionist movement was gradually gaining influence. John Brown was a radical abolitionist, convinced that the immediate and violent destruction of the institution of slavery was necessary. He viewed an armed uprising of enslaved people as a possible means to achieve this goal. In October 1859, Brown and a group of approximately 20 followers seized a federal arsenal in the town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The plan involved capturing weapons and distributing them among enslaved people in order to initiate a large-scale uprising. The raid progressed slowly and failed to gain the expected support. No mass uprising occurred. Local militias and federal troops quickly surrounded the town. After 2 days, the resistance was suppressed. John Brown was captured, put on trial by the state of Virginia, and sentenced to death. He was hanged in December 1859. Other participants in the raid were either killed during the fighting or executed later. The raid on Harper's Ferry did not lead to immediate political changes and did not trigger an uprising. However, the event received widespread public attention and intensified tensions between the northern and the southern states, becoming one of the episodes that preceded the American Civil War. In terms of scale, it was a localized armed action carried out by a limited group of individuals that did not develop into a mass movement. Level 2 of the iceberg, thousands of participants. At the next level of the iceberg are events involving not hundreds but thousands of people. One such episode is known as the Haymarket Affair, which took place in Chicago in 1886. In the second half of the 19th century, the United States was undergoing rapid industrialization. The expansion of factories and railroads was accompanied by harsh working conditions, long working hours, and the absence of social protections. Against this background, the labor movement gained strength, demanding a reduction of the workday to 8 hours. On May 1, 1886, mass strikes and demonstrations began across the country, involving tens of thousands of workers. In Chicago, protests continued for several days. On May 4th, a rally was held at Haymarket Square with several thousand people in attendance. The gathering remained relatively peaceful until police intervention. During the dispersal, a bomb was thrown into the crowd. The explosion killed police officers and demonstrators alike. Following the blast, police opened fire and the confrontation escalated into violence. The identity of the person who threw the bomb was never established. Nevertheless, authorities arrested a number of anarchists and labor activists. 8 individuals were convicted, 4 of whom were executed, despite the lack of direct evidence linking them to the bombing. The Haymarket Affair did not lead to immediate political change and effectively halted radical labor activism in the United States for several years. At the same time, the events had a lasting impact on the international labor movement and contributed to the establishment of May 1st as a symbol of the struggle for workers' rights. The next event at this level is the protest known as the Bonus Army, which took place in the United States in 1932. After the end of the First World War, American veterans were promised financial compensation for their service. The payments were scheduled to be issued in 1945. By the early 1930s, however, the country was in the midst of the Great Depression, and many veterans found themselves unemployed and without means of support. In the spring and summer of 1932, former servicemen and their families began arriving in Washington, D.C. According to various estimates, between 15,000 and 25,000 people gathered in the capital. The primary demand of the protesters was the early payment of the promised compensation. Participants established camps in several areas of the city, including locations near the Capitol. Demonstrations and petitions to Congress were generally organized and peaceful. A bill authorizing early payments was considered but rejected by the Senate. After Congress refused the proposal, a significant number of protesters remained in the city. The administration of President Herbert Hoover decided to forcibly remove the camps. In July 1932, federal troops were deployed to disperse the protesters. During the operation, the camps were burned, clashes occurred, and injuries and deaths were reported. The protest was fully suppressed, and participants were removed from the capital. The Bonus Army protests did not lead to immediate policy changes. However, in the following years, the issue of compensation was revisited, and in 1936, Congress passed legislation granting early payments to veterans, overriding a presidential veto. The next event is the Peterloo Massacre, which took place in the United Kingdom in 1819. In the early 19th century, England was experiencing significant economic and social strain. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the country faced rising unemployment, increasing food prices, and growing political discontent. At the same time, the system of parliamentary representation remained extremely limited. Major industrial cities had little to no representation in parliament. Against this background, a large public assembly was organized in Manchester, calling for parliamentary reform, the expansion of voting rights, and improvements in social conditions. On August 16, 1819, between 60 and 80,000 people, according to various estimates, gathered at St. Peter's Field. The demonstration was peaceful, and many participants attended with their families. Local authorities regarded the assembly as a potential threat to public order. A decision was made to arrest the speakers and disperse the crowd. Cavalry units were deployed for this purpose. During the cavalry intervention, panic broke out. People were trapped within a confined area. As a result of the clashes, at least 15 people were killed and hundreds were injured. The event became known as the Peterloo Massacre, a name deliberately referencing the Battle of Waterloo, which had taken place several years earlier. Following the incident, the authorities did not make political concessions. Instead, a series of measures known as the Six Acts were introduced, restricting freedom of assembly, the press, and political agitation. Participants and organizers of the protest were subjected to persecution. The Peterloo Massacre did not result in immediate reform of the political system. Nevertheless, it became one of the most well-known examples of the violent suppression of a peaceful protest in British history, and entered public memory as a symbol of the conflict between the state and a growing popular movement. Level 3 of the iceberg, tens of thousands of participants. The third level of the iceberg includes events involving tens of thousands of people. One of the key examples is the labor conflict known as the UK miners' strike, which took place in the United Kingdom between 1984 and 1985. In the early 1980s, the British government implemented wide-ranging economic reforms aimed at reducing the size of the public sector and restructuring unprofitable industries. The coal industry, managed by the state-owned National Coal Board, was identified as one such sector. In 1984, plans were announced to close a number of coal mines. In response, the National Union of Mine Workers initiated a strike. The protest quickly became nationwide in scope. At various points, tens of thousands of miners participated across the country. The strike was not authorized by a national ballot, which later became one of the most controversial aspects within the trade union movement itself. The conflict lasted nearly a year and was marked by large-scale picketing, clashes with police, and deep divisions within British society. The state deployed significant police forces to keep mines operating and to maintain control over key transportation routes. At the same time, measures were introduced to restrict the financial resources of the unions. In March 1985, the strike was called off without an agreement to preserve the mines. In the years that followed, a substantial portion of the coal industry was shut down, and the sector was dramatically reduced. The miners' strike did not alter the government's economic course and did not escalate into a broader political crisis. However, it became one of the largest social conflicts in modern British history and affected entire regions of the country. The next event at this level is the Kent State protests, which took place in the United States in 1970. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become one of the primary sources of political and social tension in the United States. Large-scale anti-war protests were taking place across the country, including on university campuses. In April 1970, President Richard Nixon announced the expansion of military operations into Cambodia, triggering a new wave of protests. In early May 1970, student demonstrations against the war began at Kent State University in Ohio. Over the course of several days, the protests intensified and were accompanied by the burning of an ROTC building and clashes with police. State authorities decided to deploy units of the National Guard to restore order. On May 4, 1970, during another rally on campus, the National Guard attempted to disperse the demonstrators. During the confrontation, guardsmen opened fire on the crowd. As a result of the shooting, 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded. The events at Kent State provoked widespread public reaction. In the days that followed, more than 400 universities and colleges across the country were closed due to strikes and protests involving tens of thousands of students. The anti-war movement reached one of its peaks of activity. Investigations into the shootings did not result in criminal convictions of National Guard personnel. Authorities acknowledged the need for a compensation to the families of those killed, but official responsibility for the shootings remained a subject of dispute. The Kent State protests did not lead to immediate changes in United States foreign policy. However, they became one of the most widely known episodes of internal conflict associated with the Vietnam War. The next event at the third level is the Paris Commune, which existed in France in 1871. The Paris Commune emerged against the backdrop of France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and a deep political crisis. After the surrender of Paris and the collapse of the Second Empire, power passed to a provisional government based in Versailles. Relations between the government and the population of Paris quickly deteriorated. On March 18, 1871, an attempt to disarm the National Guard in Paris led to open conflict. Power in the city shifted to the Commune, a self-governing body formed by representatives of various political currents, including Republicans, socialists, and anarchists. Tens of thousands of people participated in the governance of Paris, both within the National Guard and in civilian administrative structures. The Commune implemented a series of measures related to labor relations, education, the role of the church, and local self-government. At the same time, serious disagreements persisted between different factions within the Commune regarding the future political direction. The central government, led by Adolphe Thiers, refused to recognize the Commune and concentrated its forces in Versailles. In May 1871, government troops began an assault on Paris. Fighting in the city lasted for about a week and was accompanied by extensive destruction and significant loss of life. By the end of May, the Paris Commune was fully suppressed. Thousands of its supporters were killed during the fighting or executed afterward. Many others were arrested or sent into exile. The Paris Commune existed for just over 2 months and did not lead to long-term changes in the political system of France. Nevertheless, it became one of the most significant examples of urban uprising in the 19th century and entered history as a brief experiment in alternative governance of a national capital. The Paris Commune belongs to the level of the iceberg where protest and political movements involved tens of thousands of participants and temporarily resulted in a local change of power, but failed to establish themselves at the scale of the state. Level 4 of the iceberg, hundreds of thousands of participants. The fourth level of the iceberg includes events in which participation reached hundreds of thousands of people. One such episode was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. After the Second World War, Hungary fell within the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. A one-party socialist system was established, accompanied by political repression, economic hardship, and restrictions on civil liberties. By the mid-1950s, dissatisfaction with the existing order had become widespread. On October 23, 1956, a student demonstration began in Budapest and quickly developed into a mass movement. Within days, protests spread across the capital and to other cities throughout the country. According to various estimates, hundreds of thousands of people took part in the events, including students, workers, soldiers, and urban residents. The protesters put forward demands for political reform, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and the restoration of national sovereignty. In several regions, revolutionary committees were formed, and armed groups engaged in clashes with security forces. Imre Nagy was appointed prime minister and announced a course toward political change, including Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. In early November, the Soviet Union decided to intervene militarily. On November 4, 1956, Soviet forces entered Budapest and other key cities. The fighting lasted several days and was accompanied by significant casualties on both sides. By mid-November, the resistance was suppressed. The Hungarian government was replaced, and Imre Nagy was later arrested and executed. Thousands of participants in the uprising were subjected to repression, and tens of thousands of people fled the country. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 did not result in a change to the political system and ended with the restoration of the previous order under Soviet control. The event remains one of the most significant examples of a large-scale armed mass uprising in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. The next event at the fourth level is the Prague Spring, which took place in Czechoslovakia in 1968. By the mid-1960s, the country was experiencing growing economic difficulties and public dissatisfaction with the rigid model of socialist governance. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and announced a reform course that became known as socialism with a human face. The reforms included the relaxation of censorship, the expansion of freedom of speech, limitations on the role of the secret police, and discussions of economic transformation. These changes received broad public support. During the spring and summer of 1968, hundreds of thousands of people actively participated in the political life of the country through rallies, public debates, press publications, and the activities of newly formed civic organizations. The leadership of the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries viewed these developments as a threat to the stability of the socialist bloc. Despite negotiations and assurances of continued alliance commitments, a decision was made to intervene militarily. On the night of August 21, 1968, Warsaw Pact troops entered the territory of Czechoslovakia. The occupation was accompanied by mass protests, acts of civil resistance, and spontaneous demonstrations involving hundreds of thousands of residents of Prague and other cities. No large-scale armed resistance occurred. By the autumn of 1968, the reformist course was dismantled. Alexander Dubček was removed from power, and the political system was returned to a rigid, party-controlled model. A period known as normalization began, characterized by political purges and the restoration of censorship. The Prague Spring did not lead to a change in the political system of Czechoslovakia and ended with the restoration of control by a pro-Soviet leadership. Nevertheless, it became one of the most prominent examples of a mass reform movement in Eastern Europe, involving hundreds of thousands of participants. Unlike the previous events at this level, the next uprising was not initially conceived as a mass movement. However, its consequences affected hundreds of thousands of people. This event is known as the Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland. By the early 20th century, Ireland remained under the control of the British Empire. Despite the existence of Irish parliamentary representation, the question of independence remained unresolved. Radical nationalist organizations viewed armed action as the only means of changing the country's political status. In April 1916, a group of Irish Republicans, including members of the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and a secret revolutionary brotherhood, organized an armed uprising in Dublin. Approximately 1,500 people took part directly in the fighting. On April 24th, the insurgents seized a number of key buildings in the city and proclaimed the Irish Republic. However, the planned support outside Dublin proved limited, and British authorities quickly redeployed troops to the capital. For approximately 1 week, street fighting continued throughout the city, accompanied by artillery bombardment and significant destruction. On April 29th, the leadership of the uprising decided to surrender. The leaders of the movement were arrested, and in the following weeks, most of them were executed. These actions provoked a strong reaction within Irish society and led to growing support for the idea of independence. Although the Easter Rising of 1916 did not result in the immediate separation of Ireland from the United Kingdom, it became a turning point in the country's political history. In the years that followed, mass support for the Republican movement increased significantly, ultimately leading to the War of Independence and the establishment of the Irish Free State. Level 5 of the iceberg, millions of participants. The fifth level of the iceberg includes events involving millions of people. One of the largest examples was the wave of protests and uprisings collectively known as the Arab Spring. The events began in late 2010 in Tunisia following the self-immolation of a street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi. This incident became a catalyst for mass protests against unemployment, corruption, political repression, and authoritarian rule. Throughout 2011, protest movements spread across several countries in the Middle East and North Africa, including Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. Millions of people took part in street demonstrations, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. In Egypt, according to various estimates, hundreds of thousands and at times millions of citizens participated in protests at Tahrir Square and in other cities. Mass mobilizations also occurred in Tunisia and Yemen, where incumbent leaders were forced to step down. In a number of countries, the protests escalated into armed conflicts. In Libya and Syria, the events developed into civil wars involving external actors. In other states, protest movements were suppressed by force or resulted in limited political changes. The outcomes of the Arab Spring varied significantly by country. In some cases, there were changes in leadership. In others, previous political structures were restored or prolonged instability followed. No uniform transformation of the region's political systems ultimately occurred. Within the context of the Iceberg, the Arab Spring represents a revolutionary wave involving millions of participants spanning multiple states, but failing to produce a consistent or lasting result. It remains one of the largest protest movements of the early 21st century in terms of scale. The next event at the fifth level is the protest movement known as the Iranian Green Movement, which unfolded in Iran in 2009. The trigger for the mass protests was the presidential election held in June 2009. After the official results were announced, declaring the re-election of the incumbent president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, by a wide margin, a significant portion of the population questioned the outcome of the vote. Opposition candidates and their supporters claimed that the election had been affected by widespread fraud. Mass demonstrations began in major cities, most notably in Tehran. Millions of people took part in the protests, including students, members of the urban middle class, intellectuals, and city residents. The symbol of the movement became the color green, associated with the campaign of opposition candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. The protests were predominantly peaceful and included marches, rallies, and acts of civil disobedience. In response, the authorities deployed security forces, including the police and units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Mass arrests took place, demonstrations were dispersed, and restrictions were imposed on the media and internet access. Over the course of several months, protest activity gradually declined. The leaders of the movement were isolated, and many activists were detained or forced to withdraw from public life. The official election results were not revised. The Iranian Green Movement did not lead to changes in the country's political system and ended with the restoration of state control. Nevertheless, it became the largest protest movement in the history of the Islamic Republic and demonstrated the scale of public dissatisfaction within the existing political order. The next event at the fifth level is the uprising in India of 1857, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. By the mid-19th century, a large part of the Indian subcontinent was under the control of the British East India Company. The company maintained its own army, administrative apparatus, and effectively performed the functions of a state. British rule was accompanied by economic reforms, interference in traditional social and religious practices, and the redistribution of land. The immediate trigger for the uprising was a controversy surrounding new cartridges for Enfield rifles. According to rumors, the cartridges were greased with animal fats that offended the religious beliefs of both Hindus and Muslims. However, the causes of the rebellion were far broader. They included dissatisfaction with military service, tax policies, the annexation of princely states, and the erosion of local autonomy. In May 1857, the uprising began with a mutiny by sepoys, Indian soldiers serving in the East India Company's army in the city of Meerut. Soon, the unrest spread across vast areas of northern and central India. The movement involved soldiers, peasants, urban populations, and members of the local elite. In terms of scale, the rebellion affected millions of people. The rebels captured cities, attacked British garrisons, and proclaimed the restoration of traditional forms of authority. One of the symbolic centers of the uprising became Delhi, where the last emperor of the Mughal dynasty was proclaimed. At the same time, coordination between different centers of resistance remained limited. British authorities deployed additional troops to India and began a systematic suppression of the uprising. The fighting lasted for more than a year and was accompanied by heavy casualties on both sides. By mid-1858, the main centers of resistance had been eliminated. The rebellion of 1857 did not lead to the expulsion of British rule. However, its consequences were far-reaching. The East India Company was abolished, and control over India was transferred directly to the British Crown. Reforms of the army and administration were carried out, and policies toward local elites were revised. Within the context of the Iceberg, this was one of the earliest events of the colonial era to involve millions of participants. It represented a broad anti-colonial crisis that did not result in immediate political independence, but fundamentally altered the structure of governance in the region. Level 6 of the Iceberg, tens of millions of participants. The deepest level of the iceberg is the series of revolutions of 1848 in Europe, also known as the Springtime of Nations. By the mid-19th century, Europe was experiencing a systemic crisis. Economic downturns, poor harvests, rising food prices, and accelerating industrialization intensified social tensions. At the same time, ideas of nationalism, liberalism, and constitutional reform were spreading across the continent, coming into direct conflict with existing monarchical regimes. In 1848, a wave of revolutionary uprisings spread almost simultaneously across dozens of states and regions, including France, the German Confederation, the Austrian Empire, Italy, Hungary, and other parts of Europe. The movements involved workers, peasants, students, members of the bourgeoisie, and national liberation groups. In terms of combined scale, the events involved tens of millions of people. In France, the revolution led to the fall of the July monarchy and the proclamation of the Second Republic. In the German states, national assemblies were convened and attempts were made to establish a unified nation-state. In the Austrian Empire, uprisings erupted in Vienna, Prague, and Budapest, accompanied by demands for autonomy and political freedoms. Despite initial concessions by ruling authorities, by the end of 1849, most revolutionary movements had been suppressed. Monarchies reasserted control, national projects were postponed, and many revolutionary leaders were forced into exile or subjected to repression. Only limited changes, such as the abolition of serfdom in certain regions, remained in effect over the long term. The revolutions of 1848 did not result in an immediate transformation of Europe's political systems. However, they revealed the scale of public discontent and demonstrated that the crisis extended beyond individual states to encompass an entire continent. The next event at the deepest level of the iceberg is the democratic movement in China of 1989, often referred to as the Chinese democracy movement. By the late 1980s, China was undergoing economic reforms accompanied by rising social inequality, inflation, and corruption. At the same time, the political system remained one party with strict control over public and political life. These contradictions became a source of growing dissatisfaction, particularly among students and the urban intelligentsia. In the spring of 1989, student demonstrations began in Beijing, initially connected to the death of reform-minded party official Hu Yaobang. The protests quickly moved beyond memorial activities and took on a political character. Participants put forward demands to combat corruption, expand civil liberties, and pursue political reform. Throughout April and May, the protest movement spread to dozens of cities across the country. Students, workers, office employees, and urban residents took part in demonstrations, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. According to various estimates, tens of millions of people were involved in the events across China. The central symbol of the movement became Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where mass rallies and hunger strikes took place for several weeks. Negotiations between government representatives and protest leaders failed to produce an agreement. In early June, the country's leadership decided to impose martial law. On the night of June 3rd to June 4th, 1989, units of the People's Liberation Army entered Beijing to disperse the protests. As a result of the operation, the movement was suppressed. The exact number of those killed and injured remains a subject of dispute. After June 1989, protest activity was brought to an end, and political control was tightened. Movement leaders were arrested, exiled, or forced underground. China's political system retained its existing structure. The democratic movement of 1989 did not result in institutional political change. Nevertheless, it became one of the largest mass protest movements in Chinese history, and an example of a continent-wide protest involving tens of millions of participants. The final event at the bottom of the iceberg is the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, which unfolded in the United States and beyond during the 1960s and 1970s. United States military involvement in Vietnam began in the early 1960s and gradually expanded. As the number of American troops increased and casualties mounted, the war became the subject of growing public debate. Television coverage, the military draft, and the prolonged nature of the conflict contributed to rising dissatisfaction within the country. Early protests were local in scale. However, by the mid-1960s, the movement had grown into a mass phenomenon. Demonstrations, marches, and acts of civil disobedience took place in major American cities and on university campuses. Participants included students, members of the middle class, veterans, religious organizations, and cultural figures. By the late 1960s, the anti-war movement had become nationwide. Large-scale actions such as the March on the Pentagon in 1967 and protests following the events at Kent State involved hundreds of thousands of people at a single time. Over the course of the war, tens of millions of Americans were involved in protest activity. Anti-war demonstrations also took place in U.S. allied countries, including the United Kingdom, France, and Australia. Despite the scale of the movement, political decisions were made gradually. U.S. administrations reduced military involvement in stages, but the war continued until 1975. The formal withdrawal of troops and the end of U.S. participation were not the direct result of protests alone, but rather the outcome of a combination of military, political, and diplomatic factors. The anti-war movement did not lead to an immediate transformation of the political system or foreign policy. Nevertheless, it became one of the largest social movements of the 20th century, encompassing an entire generation and exerting a lasting influence on public attitudes toward war, state power, and civic protest. Within the framework of the Iceberg, this represents the final level, a movement involving tens of millions of people that did not crystallize into a revolution, but formed part of a deep societal crisis unfolding across time and geography. This concludes our iceberg. We have traced a path from localized uprisings involving hundreds of people to movements that engage tens of millions. If this format is of interest to you, we will continue exploring different topics through iceberg structures and historical overviews. You have been watching the Iceberg Project. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to stay connected.